Face a brand new chart for the head and for the heart. It's your journey, your tools.
Welcome to the deep dive. Today we're digging into something that feels less like a psychological theory and more like, well, common knowledge. The 5 stages of grief.
Denial, anger, bargaining, depression, acceptance. Yeah, DABD. It's achieved this incredible level of cultural saturation, hasn't it? You see it in films, books, you hear from friends trying to help.
It's everywhere. It's presented as the roadmap you follow when you lose someone.
And that's exactly what we need to challenge today, that universality.
Right.
Because when people lose someone, often the first thing they do, or others do, is reach for that checklist.
Right. But here's the mission for this deep dive. For the bereaved, the people actually dealing with the loss of a loved one, those 5 stages, they're really a cultural myth. Deeply flawed, scientifically shaky, and sometimes, honestly, quite harmful.
Yeah, that's the core of it. We need to dismantle that idea of a neat, step-by-step map. It promises order, but grief isn't orderly. And we want to replace it with, well, better tools. 3 modern frameworks that are much more fluid, backed by evidence.
Things like the dual process model, Worden's tasks of mourning, and this idea of continuing bonds. They paint a very different picture.
A picture that's much closer to the messy, dynamic reality of adapting to loss. These models focus on things like oscillation, active work, staying connected, not just moving through fixed emotional states towards detachment.
Our sources today really map out this whole story. We're going to trace where the 5 stages actually came from, why applying them to grievers was a mistake, and then contrast that with these newer, more helpful ways of thinking.
And we also have to ask, why did the 5 stages stick so hard? Why do we cling to this model?
Good question. Our sources suggest it taps right into how we're wired. We're pattern seekers, right? Storytellers.
Exactly. And grief feels like pure chaos, utterly uncontrollable. So this idea of 5 clear steps, it's seductive. It promises a kind of order, a path, an endpoint acceptance, closure.
Which feels comforting, I suppose, especially when society isn't great at sitting with long, messy emotions. It wants a neat narrative.
Yeah, low tolerance for ambiguity. The simple story won, even if it wasn't the accurate one.
Okay, so let's unpack this. Where did this giant cultural idea actually begin? We need to go back to 1969, right? Elizabeth Kubler-Ross's book on death and dying.
That's the origin point. And the context is absolutely crucial, and it's the part that almost always gets dropped.
What was that original context then?
Her work wasn't about bereavement at all. It wasn't studying the families left behind. It was groundbreaking work in the anthology, The Study of Death and Dying. Specifically, she was looking at terminally ill patients in hospitals.
So people facing their own death.
Exactly. She interviewed, as you mentioned in the outline, over 200 dying patients. Her goal was really humanistic. She wanted to understand their experience, combat the isolation and neglect they often faced, and improve how we care for people at the end of life.
So the subjects weren't grieving family members trying to figure out life after a loss. They were people grappling with their own mortality.
Right. And when you put diabetes back into that specific context, the internal experience of someone facing their own end, the stages actually make a lot more psychological sense. It's about negotiating your own impending death.
Okay, walk us through that logic again, but specifically for the dying person.
Sure. So denial was that first shock absorber. No, not me. This can't be happening. A necessary defense against overwhelming news.
That sense.
Then, as reality sinks in, anger. Why me? This is unfair. That existential rage at the situation.
Still tracking.
Then comes bargaining. This is trying to regain some control, postpone the inevitable. If I just live better, maybe I'll get more time, or let me just live long enough to see my daughter graduate. The very relevant impulse when you're facing a final deadline.
Okay.
After that, often depression. But Kubler-Ross saw this differently. She saw it as a necessary preparatory sadness, a beginning to disconnect from worldly attachments, from loved ones, sort of turning inward before the final letting go.
A kind of psychological preparation.
Exactly. And finally, acceptance, which she described not as happiness, but as a quiet state, a calm, almost neutral expectation of what's coming to terms with mortality.
That trajectory feels logical for someone preparing to leave life. But here's the absolute crux of the issue, right? The huge category error. The experience of dying is fundamentally different from the experience of being bereaved.
Fundamentally different. They're completely separate challenges. The dying person is in an intrapsychic process. It's internal. negotiating their own cessation, preparing to leave the world.
Whereas the bereaved person, they're dealing with something else entirely.
Entirely, their process is interpersonal, relational. Their challenge is adapting to a massive hole in their world, a severed relationship. They need to reconstruct their identity, figure out who they are now without that person. Their task is learning how to stay in a world that's irrevocably changed.
It's about remaining, not leaving.
Precisely. So taking a model designed for someone exiting life and applying it to someone who needs to re-engage with life after loss. It's like, as the analogy goes, using the blueprint for a single-family house to fix a skyscraper.
The scale, the function, the whole purpose is just wrong, incompatible.
Completely incompatible. The model just doesn't map onto the lived experience of grief for the bereaved.
So how did this happen? How did this observation of dying patients become this rigid law for grieving people? How did the wrong blueprint become the instruction manual everyone uses?
Well, it's a combination of things. Cultural drift, mostly, and the appeal of simplicity you mentioned. Kubler-Ross's work was important. It forced people, especially in medicine, to see the dying as human beings with emotional needs.
That's a positive legacy.
Absolutely. But as the idea of the stages spread into popular culture, it got simplified, distorted. What started as her observation of some patterns in some dying patients morphed into this rigid, step-by-step, and crucially prescriptive roadmap for the bereaved.
Prescriptive meaning people felt they had to go through it in that order.
Exactly. It became an acceptation. You must feel denial. Then you must feel anger, and so on. And if you followed the steps, you'd reach this endpoint called closure, or acceptance, and be done with grief.
Which, as we said, is comforting in the face of chaos. Grief feels so wild, so out of control.
Totally. And society, especially Western cultures, really doesn't like ambiguity or prolonged messiness. We want things neat. The 5 stages offer that neatness. A checklist, 5 steps, and you're through it. It gave everyone, the person grieving and the people around them, a sense of understanding, of control.
Almost like it gives permission to others to manage the grieving person. Oh, they're in the anger stage. That's normal. Or they seem stuck in depression. Maybe we should push them towards acceptance.
Precisely. It kind of domesticates grief, tries to tame something inherently untamable. Okay, I've checked off bargaining. I must be making progress.
It's easier to grasp than the real, fluctuating, often confusing reality of loss.
And the really ironic part, Kubler-Ross herself realized this was happening and tried to correct it. She absolutely did. Towards the end of her life, she became quite vocal about how misunderstood her work had become. Before she died in 2004, she and her co-author David Kessler explicitly tried to set the record straight.
What did she say?
She insisted the stages were never meant to help tuck messy emotions into neat packages. She clarified, they are not a linear timeline. They're not steps you have to climb in order. They're just descriptions of feelings or states that someone might experience, possibly in any order, possibly revisiting them, possibly skipping some entirely.
So she herself refuted the very rigidity that made the model so popular.
Yes, but by then, it was too late. The simple linear myth was just too sticky. It had taken root in the culture far more deeply than the complex, nuanced reality she tried to explain later. The meme outgrew the author.
Okay, so the misapplication is one major issue. But beyond that, from a scientific standpoint, the model itself has problems, right? Even in its original context.
It does. Academically, it lacks a solid empirical foundation. Remember how it was developed? Through conversations, case studies with dying patients.
Which sounds valuable humanistically, but scientifically.
Scientifically, that's anecdotal evidence. It's insightful, it can generate hypotheses, but it's considered the lowest rung on the ladder of scientific evidence. It wasn't based on systematic investigation, controlled comparisons, or statistical analysis. It was a collection of observed themes. Pioneering for its time, maybe, but not rigorous psychological science by today's standards.
And what happened when researchers did apply more rigorous methods later on, studying bereaved people over time?
The findings pretty much blew the stage theory out of the water. Modern, prospective, longitudinal studies tracking people after a loss for months, even years, consistently show that people do not follow a predictable DABDA sequence.
What did they find instead?
They find multiple different patterns or trajectories of grief, and the single most common trajectory, it's resilience.
Resilience. Now, that doesn't just mean bouncing back quickly, does it? What does resilience mean in these studies?
It means experiencing the pain. Yes, the loss is real and deeply felt, but maintaining relatively stable psychological functioning throughout. Low levels of clinical distress, depression, or incapacitation right from the start. They grieve, but they continue to function.
And how common is that?
Shockingly common. Some major studies found that this resilience trajectory accounts for nearly half of bereaved individuals, around 45–50%.
Wow. So the most common way people actually experience grief involves not falling apart in the way the stages suggest. What about the pattern that does look like the stage's intense distress that slowly fades?
That pattern, sometimes called chronic grief or recovery trajectory, where there's high initial distress that gradually lessens, only accounts for about 10–15% of people in these studies. A much smaller group experiences prolonged chronic grief, and another small group might even show delayed grief. But the dominant experience is resilience.
So the universal journey prescribed by the stages empirically fits only about 1 in 10 people, maybe slightly more. But nearly half are resilient from the get-go. That's a massive mismatch.
A massive mismatch. The data just doesn't support the universality of the stage model for bereavement. And then there's another layer of critique, the conceptual problems with the model itself.
What do you mean by conceptual problems?
Well, the stages themselves are a weird mix of different kinds of psychological constructs, all thrown together without a clear theoretical reason for why they're included or why they should follow that specific order.
Let's break that down. What kinds of constructs are mixed up?
Okay, look at them. Denial. That's primarily a cognitive defense mechanism, right? A way of thinking or not thinking about something.
Right.
Then anger and depression. Those are affective states.
Right.
Emotions, feelings.
Emotions.
Then bargaining. That's more of a behavioral strategy and action, something you do to try and cope or change things.
A behavior, got it.
And finally, acceptance. That's really a cognitive state again, or maybe an attitude, a way of understanding or framing the situation.
So it jumps from a defense mechanism, thought, to emotions, then to a behavior, then back to a thought or attitude.
Exactly. It's this jumble. There's no underlying psychological theory that explains why a cognitive defense must lead to a specific emotion like anger, which must then trigger a specific behavior like bargaining, which must result in a final cognitive state of acceptance. It's arbitrary. It just lists 5 things that can happen after a trauma, but puts them in an order that isn't theoretically justified or empirically supported as a sequence.
This isn't just academic nitpicking, though. This flawed model, applied rigidly, has real-world negative consequences for people who are grieving. Let's talk about the harm. How does it pathologize normal grief?
By setting up this prescriptive expectation, you should feel anger. You should go through depression. It makes people feel like they're failing if their experience doesn't match. If you're in that large group experiencing resilience, or if you feel intense sadness but not much anger, you start to worry. Am I grieving wrong? Is something wrong with me?
That sounds awful. You're already dealing with the loss, and now you have this extra layer of anxiety about whether you're doing grief correctly.
Exactly. Researchers call it secondary anxiety, or sometimes an iatrogenic effect harm caused by the supposed cure or framework itself. The map meant to help you navigate actually makes you doubt your own perfectly normal path. You might even try to force yourself to feel angry because the script says you should.
Can we think of some concrete examples of how this plays out and causes harm?
Sure. Think about someone who responds to loss by becoming very practical, very focused on tasks, organizing the funeral, dealing with finances, taking care of the kids. They're functioning.
Okay.
Someone using the 5-stage lens might see that and say, oh, they're in denial. They haven't broken down yet. They're avoiding their feelings.
And they might pressure them to stop being practical and start crying.
Precisely. They might pathologize that very functional coping style, urging the person to face the pain, when, in fact, that focus on tasks might be exactly what that person needs at that moment to stay grounded. It's a form of coping the newer models actually validate, as we'll see.
What's another example?
Or consider someone who primarily feels deep sadness and longing, but not much anger. A well-meaning friend, armed with the 5 stages, might say, you really need to get angry. It's unhealthy to keep it bottled up. They're trying to push an emotion that isn't actually there, which just makes the grieving person feel misunderstood and invalidated.
So the prescriptive nature leads to unhelpful advice, unhelpful interventions. The map makes people give bad directions.
That's a great way to put it. The map, intended to guide, ends up confusing the traveler and making them distrust their own instincts, their own internal compass.
Okay, we spent a good amount of time taking apart the old model, showing why it doesn't really fit for the bereaved. Now, let's completely shift gears. Let's talk about reconstruction. Moving away from that single rigid map to these more modern, fluid frameworks, like having navigational tools instead of a fixed route.
Exactly. The whole orientation shifts. These models, mostly developed from the 1990s onwards, ditch the idea of linear stages. They embrace individuality, dynamism, the back-and-forth nature of grief.
And the goal changes too, right? The old implicit goal seemed to be detachment, getting over it. What's the new goal?
The new goals are much more about adaptation and integration. Things like dynamic oscillation, actively engaging in tasks of mourning, and finding ways to maintain an enduring connection with the person who died, rather than severing ties.
Okay, let's dive into the first of these tools, the one that really captures the rhythm of how people cope day to day. The dual process model, or DPM.
Right, the dual process model, developed by Margaret Strobe and Hank Schutt. It was a direct response to those older ideas that you had to constantly confront the pain, do grief work nonstop. The DPM says basically that's impossible and probably unhealthy.
So it proposes two main types of things, or stressors, that people dealing with loss have to juggle.
That's the core idea. Two types of stressors. First, you have loss-oriented stressors, LO. This is the stuff we typically think of as grief. It's focused backwards on the loss itself.
Like what specifically?
Crying, yearning for the person, looking at old photos, feeling the emptiness, actively thinking about the deceased and the pain of their absence. It's engaging directly with the primary loss.
Okay, the pain of the loss itself. What's the other type?
The other type is restoration-oriented stressors, RO. This is about looking forward. It's about adapting to all the secondary changes and challenges that the loss brings. It's about rebuilding your life.
Secondary changes, like practical stuff.
Exactly. Practical things like learning to manage finances if your partner used to do it, figuring out childcare, maybe selling the house. But it's also about internal rebuilding, taking on new roles, figuring out your new identity now, widow, orphan, single dad, building new routines, finding new ways to live day to day.
So loss-oriented is about the past absence, restoration-oriented is about the present and future rebuilding.
We got it. And the absolute key insight of the DPM is the mechanism connecting them. Oscillation.
Oscillation, like swinging back and forth.
Precisely. Healthy coping, according to Strobe and Schutt, involves a flexible, dynamic shifting between confronting the loss, LO, and dealing with life's restoration tasks, RO. You dip into the pain, you process it, but then you need to pull back, take a break, and focus on the demands of living.
Can you give an example of that oscillation?
Sure. Imagine someone who lost their spouse. They might spend a morning feeling overwhelmed with sadness, looking through photo albums, really deep in that LO space.
Okay.
But then, in the afternoon, they might need to switch gears. They might focus entirely on learning how to use the online banking system their spouse always handled, or maybe they throw themselves into a work project, or just take the kids to the park. That's RO. They're oscillating away from the direct pain to manage life.
That makes intuitive sense. You can't just stay in the intense pain 24/7.
You can't. And this is where the DPM is so important. It validates taking breaks. It reframes avoidance.
How so? Because the old model saw avoidance as bad, right?
Right.
As denial.
Exactly. Any turning away from the pain was seen as pathological. The DPM says, no, those periods of focusing on other things, of distracting yourself, of just living, they are necessary, healthy respites. They prevent emotional overload. They let you recharge so you can go back and face the LO stuff later when you have the capacity. It's not denial, it's dosage.
Okay, but how do you know if it's healthy oscillation or unhealthy avoidance? Where's the line? Someone could just stay in RO forever, right? Just keep busy.
That's a really important question. The key difference is flexibility versus rigidity. Healthy oscillation is flexible. The person can move between LO and RO. They can choose to engage with the pain when needed and choose to take breaks when needed. They aren't stuck.
And unhealthy avoidance.
That's rigid. The person is basically trapped in RO. They might be hyperfunctional, managing all the practical tasks, but they consistently refuse or are unable to allow themselves any time or space to confront the emotional reality of the loss. The DPM validates temporary, flexible breaks, not permanent, rigid avoidance.
Got it. And this model also seems to accommodate different grieving styles.
Absolutely. It recognizes that some people are more naturally intuitive grievers, more comfortable focusing on emotions, the LO side. Others are more instrumental, more action-oriented, focused on problem-solving, the RO side. The DPM says both orientations and the ability to move between them are crucial for healthy adaptation. It makes space for different ways of coping.
Okay, so the DPM gives us the rhythm, the oscillation. Our next tool shifts the focus a bit, emphasizing that grief isn't just something that happens to you, but involves active work. This is J. William Worden's 4 Tasks of Mourning.
Exactly. This framework is powerful because it frames mourning as something you do, not something you passively endure. It gives the griever agency. And importantly, like the DPM, these tasks are not linear stages. You don't complete task 1 and then move neatly to task 2.
You can revisit them, work on multiple ones at once.
Absolutely. You might be working on task 3, adjusting to the new world, and suddenly get hit with a wave of task 1 reality again. It's much more fluid.
Okay, let's walk through them. What's task 1?
Task 1. To accept the reality of the loss. This sounds simple, but it's deeper than just intellectually knowing someone died. It's about integrating that reality on an emotional level, truly accepting that the person is physically gone and won't be coming back in the way they were.
So it's that gut punch moment, maybe months or years later, when you instinctively reach for the phone to tell them something or expect them to walk through the door.
Precisely those moments.
Yeah.
That's task 1 hitting home again, the emotional finality sinking in deeper.
Okay. Task 2.
Task 2. To process the pain of grief. Worden is very clear here. You have to feel it to heal it. This task involves actively acknowledging and working through the immense pain of the loss, which isn't just emotional. It can be physical, cognitive, spiritual.
This pushes back against the be strong, keep a stiff upper lip kind of societal pressure, doesn't it?
Directly. Worden argues that avoiding or suppressing the pain is actually the biggest obstacle to moving forward. Task 2 validates the necessity of allowing yourself to experience the suffering, however intense it is. It's necessary work.
Makes sense. Now, task 3 seems like a big one. To adjust to a world without the deceased. You mentioned we need to break this down into the 3 areas Worden identified.
Yes, this is complex because the world changes in multiple ways. First, there are the external adjustments. This is the practical stuff we touched on with DPM's RO. How does your daily life function now? Learning the skills the deceased performed, managing practical roles they filled, maybe finding new housing or work, dealing with the tangible changes.
Okay, the practical domain, what's the second?
The internal adjustments. This is about your sense of self. Who are you now? The loss can shatter your identity. If you were a spouse, you might now be a widower. If you were a child, you're now an orphan in some sense. This internal work involves grappling with these changes to your self-concept, figuring out who you are in this new reality. It's about reformulating your identity.
That sounds incredibly challenging, redefining yourself.
It is. And the third area is the spiritual adjustments. Loss often shakes our fundamental beliefs about the world, about meaning, about fairness, maybe about God or the universe. Task 3 involves wrestling with these big existential questions. Does life still make sense? What do I believe now? It's about adjusting your worldview to incorporate the reality of the loss.
External, internal, spiritual. A very comprehensive adjustment. And finally, task 4. This one feels like a real departure from older ideas.
It absolutely is. Task 4. To find an enduring connection with the deceased in the midst of embarking on a new life. Notice the language. Enduring connection, not detachment. The goal isn't to forget or cut ties. It's to figure out how to maintain a meaningful connection to the person you lost, while also moving forward and reinvesting in your own ongoing life.
So it's about finding a new kind of relationship with them.
Exactly. It's about emotionally relocating the deceased. Finding a place for them in your inner life, in your memories, in your values, that allows you to continue living fully, rather than feeling like you have to leave them behind entirely to heal. This task sets the stage perfectly for our third model.
Yeah, task 4 flows right into this idea of continuing bonds. This feels like the most radical shift from, say, Freud's old idea that healthy mourning meant withdrawing energy from the lost person.
It's a total paradigm shift. Developed by folks like Klass, Silverman, and Nickman around the mid-90s, this theory directly challenges that traditional goal of detachment or closure.
So what's the core concept?
The core concept is that maintaining an ongoing internal relationship with the person who died is actually normal, healthy, and adaptive for most people. The bond doesn't break, it transforms.
Older models might have seen talking to the deceased or keeping rituals as getting stuck, right?
Yes. Potentially pathological. Continuing bonds theory says, no, these can be signs of healthy adaptation. The relationship continues, just in a different form. And importantly, as you mentioned, it's not static. The bond evolves as you evolve.
How you relate to their memory at 25 might be different than at 55.
Absolutely. As you mature, face new life challenges, your internal representation of them, the meaning you draw from the relationship, it continues to develop too. The goal isn't letting go. It's finding a new way to hold on that integrates their memory and influence into your ongoing life in a positive way.
What are some concrete ways these continuing bonds manifest healthily?
Oh, many ways. Internally, it could be having conversations in your head with them, seeking their imagined advice or approval when facing a decision. What would mom have done here?
Mm.
feeling their presence, sometimes in dreams. Externally, it's things like consciously keeping memories alive through storytelling, sharing stories about them with new people in your life.
Maintaining rituals, too.
Yes, visiting a grave or special place, celebrating their birthday in some way, continuing a tradition you shared. And a really powerful one is using the deceased as a role model, carrying forward their values, their passions, maybe finishing a project they started.
Like starting a charity in their name or pursuing a career they inspired.
Exactly. All these things integrate the person into your present and future. It reframes mourning not as separation, but as finding ways to keep their influence alive as a source of strength and identity as you move forward. They become a kind of relational anchor in your life story.
Is there a point where continuing bonds become less healthy? The theory must address that too.
Yes, definitely. The nuance is crucial. The key is integration versus stagnation or idealization. Bonds are adaptive when they're woven into a life that is also embracing new experiences, new relationships, and moving forward. They provide comfort and guidance within that forward movement.
And when are they problematic?
They can become problematic if they're extremely intense, perhaps highly externalized, like keeping a room exactly as it was for years, refusing any changes, and if they prevent the person from engaging with present life or forming new attachments. Especially after traumatic losses, some forms of very intense bonding might be linked with ongoing distress or complicated grief. So it's about a bond that supports life, not one that freezes it.
Okay, so we have these three powerful frameworks: dual process model for the rhythm, Warden's tasks for the active work, and continuing bonds for the relational outcome. You've emphasized they aren't competing, but complementary. How do they work together as a unified system?
Think of it like this. Warden's tasks tell you what needs to be done, the essential jobs of mourning, like accepting reality, processing pain, adjusting, finding that connection.
Okay, the what?
The dual process model tells you how you might manage doing that work, the rhythm of it. It explains the oscillation, how you engage with the painful tasks, LO, and then take breaks to deal with life restoration, RO, so you don't get overwhelmed.
The how and the pacing.
Exactly. And continuing bonds theory really elaborates on the outcome of Warden's Task 4. It gives depth and detail to what that enduring connection actually looks like and feels like, sometimes decades down the line. They fit together seamlessly.
Can we walk through that synergy again with that example? The widow dealing with practical and emotional tasks?
Sure. Let's revisit her. So maybe on Saturday morning, she's deep in loss-oriented coping, DPM. She's looking at photos, crying, actively working on Warden's Task 2, process the pain.
Okay, deep in the grief work.
Right. But that's exhausting. So by Sunday, she needs to oscillate DPM into restoration-oriented coping. She decides to tackle a practical problem related to Warden's Task 3, adjust to a world without the deceased. Maybe she needs to call the bank about the mortgage. That's an external adjustment.
So she shifted from LO to RO and from task 2 focus to task 3 focus.
Exactly. And while she's on the phone with the bank, maybe she pauses before agreeing to something. In that moment, she might briefly engage in a continuing bond, Class Silverman. She has a quick internal thought. What would John have advised here? He was always so careful with finances. She uses that internalized memory of him to guide her decision in the present.
Ah, so all three are working together right there. Oscillation, DPM, allows her to shift to the practical task, Warden Task 3, and the continuing bond provides internal guidance while she's doing it.
Precisely. She's not stuck. She's flexibly moving between confronting the past, LO Task 2, rebuilding the present, RO Task 3, and using the integrated memory of the relationship, continuing bonds Task 4, to navigate her future. It's dynamic.
That feels so much more realistic and, frankly, hopeful than the rigid stages. It acknowledges the complexity.
It does. Because these modern models don't give you that false promise of a neat, predictable timeline. They don't say, you should be here by 6 months. Instead, they offer a set of tools, a compass. They acknowledge that grief is active, it's nonlinear, it's deeply personal, and ultimately, it's about integration and finding your own unique way forward.
Recognizing that you can be both hurting and healing, grieving and rebuilding, remembering and living, all at the same time.
That's the essence of it. So, wrapping up this deep dive, we've essentially traded that pervasive cultural myth of the 5 stages, which, remember, originated from observing dying patients, not grieving ones, for the much clearer, more scientifically grounded understanding offered by the dual process model, Warden's tasks, and continuing bonds.
The old map was broken, often misleading, sometimes even harmful because it set up unrealistic expectations. But this modern compass, these combined tools, they seem much better equipped to help navigate the actual territory of grief.
They acknowledge the reality, the fluidity, the individuality of it all.
And as we close out, we want to leave you with a final thought to mull over, building directly on that idea of continuing bonds. If the relationship truly doesn't end, but transforms, think about this. What might your connection with your lost loved one look like, feel like, not just next year, but maybe 20 or 30 years from now?
Mm.
How might their influence, their values, their memory continue to subtly shape who you become, the choices you make, long after the sharpest edges of the pain have softened? How might they continue to be a living relational anchor woven into the fabric of your whole life story?
That's a powerful reflection on enduring connection. Thank you for sharing your sources and exploring this with us.
Until next time.
It's the strength to build anew. It's the light to guide you through. It's the choice to find your way. Starting here, starting today.
And that wraps up our look at the grief myth. It's so important to move past these broken models to find what actually works. Join me next week for our 4th episode, Ditch the Stages, a compassionate deep dive into dynamic models of loss. We'll be exploring modern, evidence-based frameworks like the dual process model that are far more flexible, compassionate, and helpful for understanding the reality of grief. Hit that subscribe button if you've found these tools helpful. And if you'd like to support the show, you can find our donation link in the show notes. For all extras, check out yourjourneyyourtools.com and the app at yourjourneyyourtools.app. Thanks again for listening, and I'll catch you next week on your journey.